When it comes to dividend investing, I think a lot of dividend investors fall in love with the concept of monthly dividends. And I think the reason for that is because it looks a lot like supplemental income, like a Social Security check or a pension check. And it just makes individuals a lot more likely to be able to plan around their expenses with their income with these monthly payments. And I also do invest in an ETF that pays monthly dividends, and this is JEPI, or the JP Morgan Equity Premium Income ETF. Now, there are many different types of monthly dividend ETFs out there, but I think most of them fall into three varieties. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go and show you three examples of different ETFs and pretty much cover the three main categories that these ETFs are in. And before we get started, remember, if you do appreciate this video, leave it a like to get this content out there and subscribe for future content. Now, these monthly dividend ETFs are typically high yield ETFs because the intent is to supplement your income. So most of them are going to be geared to high yield dividends. Now, some of these aren't necessarily high yield, but I'm going to show you kind of different varieties of these ETFs. So this first segment that I'm going to go over is conventional dividend ETFs. And SPHD, or the Invesco SP 500 High Dividend Low Volatility ETF, is an example of a conventional dividend ETF. I think that this ETF is probably easiest for most people to understand. Now, what this ETF did is selected 50 securities in the S&P 500 index that historically have provided high dividend yield and low volatility. So what you get from that is a diverse list of high dividend yielding stocks. And of course, in tune with this video is an ETF that pays monthly. So SPHD, every single month around the last week of the month, you're going to be getting a dividend payment consistently. Now, why do I consider this a conventional ETF? Well, it's pretty simple. This ETF doesn't use anything like options or exchange-linked notes to increase the yield of this ETF. It is very standard in its selection methodology, and I would say, again, it is conventional. It picks high-yield dividend stocks and then constructs this portfolio. Pretty easy for people to understand. It picks stocks like AT&T, Coca-Cola, Altria, and so on and so forth to basically make a high yield dividend ETF. So another ETF that would fall into the category of SPHD would be DGRW. That is the Wisdom Tree US Quality Dividend Growth Fund. This ETF also pays monthly, although it is not a high yield ETF. This focuses on dividend growth paying companies. So you're not going to get this high yield, but I would also consider it a conventional dividend ETF because it doesn't use things like exchange-linked notes or options to increase the yield at all. So again, just like SPHD, you're going to be getting a monthly dividend around the last week of the month. And of course, this ETF, again, isn't a high-yielding ETF, and the dividend payment varies quite a bit. But you're still going to get that monthly payment, just more focused on dividend growth rather than dividend yield. Quickly moving back to SPHD, I want to say that these dividend ETFs generally have a limit into how high yielding their dividend will get. You're really not going to see a dividend yield above 4 to 5%. Unless you go international. Usually these dividend ETFs, if they want diversity, you're going to basically get a maximum number or maximum yield of 4 to 5% because there aren't too many quality dividend paying companies out there that are going into that 5, 6, 7% range. SPHD selects the 50 highest yielding dividend stocks and then screens them by volatility, and you get a yield of about 5 to 4% with most of those stocks. So you're really not going to get huge yields out of these conventional ETFs. Moving on to type 2, and a type 2 ETF is kind of a blend ETF. I would categorize that. So a blend ETF is basically an ETF like JEPI, an ETF that I hold here. And these ETFs generally offer a mix of dividend paying companies. So you're going to be getting dividends, but they also supplement that with exchange linked notes or something like covered calls or another exotic option strategy to really increase that yield. So the underlying assets may or may not be high yield dividend paying companies or dividend paying companies at all. In the case of JEPI, it basically selects US large cap stocks and kind of screens them for volatility. So if we take a quick look at the portfolio, you'll notice a lot of these companies aren't really high yielding dividends. But what they do is they supplement that with something called exchange linked notes. So if we look at how this is created, it uses a disciplined options overlay and implements written out of the money S&P 500 call options that seek to distribute monthly income. And with that, you get an ETF that basically pays you a mix of dividends and also options premium. Now with JEPI, most of the income you're going to be getting is from options income, and 1 to 2% of that is going to be from dividends. Now, this is going to be a very important thing. So what does this mean as a dividend investor? Well, as a dividend investor, it basically means you are going to get a greater yield than the conventional ETFs like SPHD, which I mentioned before. If you take a look at this is from the NASDAQ page. I'm not sure if it's exactly current right now, but currently JEPI has a dividend yield of 6.32%. And if we go back to SPHD, remember that dividend ETF that selected some of the highest yielding dividend stocks in the S&P 500, you see a dividend yield of 3.72%. So JEPI is going to be quite a bit higher than these conventional ETFs. Now, the caveat to that is the dividend is going to jump around quite a bit because of the way these ETFs work. Based on those exchange-linked notes or covered calls, the volatility in the market is really going to impact how much you are going to be getting paid. So if we take a look at this cash amount here, you're going to see this dividend jump around quite a bit. Now, in all, you're still going to generally be getting paid a large dividend, but based on the volatility in the market, that is going to change quite a bit because the way these options work is that when a volatility in the market rises, options premium rises as well. And as an investor in these ETFs, you're going to be entitled to that higher premium when the market volatility is high, but when it shrinks, you're going to be receiving less premium, of course, at the same time. So if I want you to just remember this cash amount column here, and then let's take a look back at SPHD, and you'll see that the dividend is a lot more narrow. There isn't as much jumping in these payments. So some people say that ETFs like SPHD, it's a lot easier to forecast how much you're going to be getting paid. And that is true compared to an ETF like JEPI. Now, in the same class of ETF as JEPI, we have an ETF like Devo. So this ETF selects high quality dividend oriented stocks and then basically sells covered calls on those stocks itself. So if we take a quick look, if you notice, a lot of these stocks aren't necessarily high yielding dividend stocks. Some of them are, but you have quite a few here that don't pay that high of a yield, like Microsoft and Visa, McDonald's, and so on and so forth. The largest portion of that income is going to be from the covered calls that it sells on those stocks. Now, Devo uses a slightly different approach than JEPI in all, but you are going to see that higher dividend yield. If you do remember, SPHD paid in the 3% range. This is going to pay in the upper 4s. And you're also going to see that dividend jump around a little bit, although not as much as JEPI, because the way it sells those covered calls is a little bit different. But you're still going to see that dividend jump around based on volatility in the market. So these are, again, the blend class ETFs. They basically combine dividend stocks with a covered call or an exchange-linked note strategy to produce a higher yield than what you'd get with a conventional method. And then we have the final class of ETFs, which I would say are the exotic class of ETFs. These ETFs don't necessarily have a singular strategy, but they basically center entirely around an option strategy to generate huge income one way or the other. In this case, I am going to show QYLD. It's one of the most popular dividend ETFs or income ETFs of this strategy, and it's probably the most simple to understand. It sells covered calls on the NASDAQ 100. So QQQ is an ETF that tracks the NASDAQ 100. Think of selling covered calls on that 1 month out, and that's pretty much how this does it. This offers an incredibly high yield. And there are dividend ETFs in this class that yield even higher than this. This one yields about 12%. Remember, the conventional ETF, SPHD, yielded in the 3% range. This one is an entirely different class of its own, as you can see, at 12%. And because this is a covered call strategy, remember that is a type of options. This dividend will also jump around quite a bit, but you're going to get a massive payment every single month. Now, again, in QYLD's case, this ETF operates by selling a covered call on the whole value of their underlying, in this case, it's the NASDAQ 100, 1 month out, and then pretty much holding them until 1 day prior to the expiration date. And this generates quite a bit of income. And another ETF in that same class is the QYLD ETF. It operates pretty much the same way as QYLD, but instead of selling covered calls on the NASDAQ 100, this sells covered calls with the exact same methodology on the S&P 500. Both of these ETFs are going to pay you quite a bit higher dividend yield than the conventional ETF or the blend ETF. And finally, I want to finish on performance. So basically, owning these ETFs come with quite a bit of difference in capital appreciation as a whole. Generally, when you get higher dividend yields, you are sacrificing capital appreciation. This is kind of why I like the blend ETFs a lot better than the ETFs like QYLD, because if you notice, now this is even with dividends reinvested, QYLD still underperforms quite a bit, while JEPI in this case performed the best throughout this time period, and SPHD, which was the conventional, performed a little less behind. And again, this doesn't even include something like any sort of taxes you might have to pay on those distributions. I think these blend ETFs like JEPI or Devo probably perform a lot better over time than an ETF like QYLD. Now, of course, if you need huge income and you need it today, QYLD might not be the worst choice, or ETFs like it. Again, this video isn't necessarily to cover specific ETFs, it's to show a generalization of different classes of these monthly ETFs. But if you need those high dividend yields every single month, those ETFs might have their place, but generally they are going to lag over time. I hope I was able to give everyone a quick overview of different classes of monthly dividend ETFs. There's so many different dividend ETFs out there that pay monthly. It would probably take me a few hours to go through a video that covered all the different ways these monthly ETFs are created or what their investment methodology is. So I basically wanted to cover the main three. Anyway, remember, if you did appreciate this content, leave this video a like and subscribe for future content, and I'll see you all in the next video.